Hello everyone! Let's kick off Bio 202 with the cardiovascular system and blood. Okay, so this is just a quick reminder of the fluids of the body. Remember, every cell of the body is going to have to get nutrients, minerals, oxygen, and give off waste products and carbon dioxide. So there has to be gas exchange as well as nutrient exchange. The way we do that is via the bloodstream and interstitial fluid. So in this image, what you're seeing here are these brown sort of rectangular shaped objects are your cells. The red here are your blood vessels, in this case capillaries, and this green are something called lymphatic capillaries, and we'll talk a little bit more about lymphatic capillaries in another section. But there's a small amount of space between the actual blood vessels and lymphatic capillaries as well as the cells. That space is called interstitial space. And fluid, as you can kind of see these arrows, there's fluid that's leaking out of the capillaries into this interstitial space, and that fluid is called interstitial fluid. All right, and that fluid will have all the nutrients, again, oxygen, gases that the cells need in order to survive and grow. Conversely, the cells will be giving off waste products, and some of that will actually go back into the capillaries. And whatever can't be picked up by these capillaries will be picked up by the lymphatic capillaries. So it's just important to kind of keep in mind when we're talking about this, right, that blood is staying in our blood vessels. Fluid is going to leak out of those blood vessels in the capillary space naturally into this interstitial space, bathe the cells so they can get their oxygen and nutrients, and then also take away waste products back toward the heart, back toward the kidneys to be filtered. Okay, so let's talk about some of the functions of blood, right? As we just mentioned, one of its main jobs is to transport different gases as well as waste, nutrients, and even heat, right? So you all know this, like if you've been running or exercising really hard, you become flushed, like you can see the soccer player. Right, she's flushed. So the blood vessels in the face dilate as well as other parts of the body, and that's to help dissipate some of the heat into the environment. Blood will also transport hormones, very super important. This means that any hormone can potentially have an effect on any cell of the body, provided that there's a receptor there. And we'll talk more about hormones toward the end of this course. Blood will also help regulate different things. So again, body temperature, as we just mentioned, regulate pH, really important. We're going to keep a fairly constant pH in our bodies. One of the reasons why some of those things like alkaline waters and all that kind of nonsense don't actually work like the way that they advertise them. Your body neutralizes that very quickly in the stomach. And as well as they help regulate water content of cells by, again, this regulation of ions as well as proteins. Okay, so they keep the proper environment so that cells do not shrivel up nor do they swell and burst. Now we talk about blood, again in blood vessels. It is technically thicker than water, just like the saying says. And because of that, it tends to flow slower than water. I think we all recognize that. We've all cut ourselves at one point or another, and blood doesn't quite roll off the way water does off our hands. Technically, our blood has a slightly elevated temperature. This makes sense. We're endothermic animals. The pH, as I mentioned, is tightly regulated. The average is 7.4, but the range of 7.35, 7.45 is a range that your body tries to maintain. I don't expect you to know the percentage of body weight or memorize that for an exam or anything. That's more just as an FYI. As well as those blood volume amounts, you don't need to memorize those. Again, it's just an FYI. Not surprisingly, males, this is sort of textbook numbers, males tend to be larger than females, so they tend to have more blood. And we'll talk about the different hormones of the blood in a little bit. Components, if we were to stick a vial of blood into a centrifuge and spin it, what we would find is that it is about 55% plasma. We'll talk about the components of plasma in a slide. And about 45% red blood cells, and then there's this tiny little amount that is composed of white blood cells and platelets. So plasma is mostly water, and as you can see in this top image, again, as it's centrifuged down, when we take out the red blood cells, it looks kind of, they describe it as a straw yellow, and it's kind of got this light yellowish color to it. Again, mostly water. This makes sense. Most of your blood is water. It's about 7% plasma proteins, and these proteins are going to be really important. They're created by the liver. They stay in the bloodstream. These proteins under normal conditions would not be leaking out of the blood vessels. One of the main ones is albumin. Now, albumin is going to be there to maintain your osmotic pressure. Now, osmotic pressure is simply, you can think of it as the draw that a liquid has for more water. So we want to maintain a fairly constant osmotic pressure so that water doesn't just completely leave the blood vessels. It stays within there. As I mentioned a couple slides ago, some of the fluids leak out into the interstitial space. We don't want all of that to leak out, so that these proteins keep it inside the blood vessels and help draw it back in as well. Globulins, fully named immunoglobulins, these are antibodies. They're going to form something called an antigen-antibody complex. We'll talk more about that a little bit later. As well as fibrinogen. We'll talk more about fibrinogen in a little bit when we talk about clotting. But fibrinogen is the inert or inactive form of fibrin, and fibrin is what causes blood clots. These are these fibrin threads that are formed. So you have fibrinogen, and unless it's activated, it doesn't actually form the threads. And then the last 1.5% is other stuff, electrolytes, nutrients, hormones, gases, waste products, things like that. You all are probably very familiar with techniques of blood sampling. We've probably all had our blood drawn at one point or another. A tourniquet is applied that helps prevent the flow of blood back up toward the heart. So the veins in that body region swell up a little bit, makes it a little bit easier to put a needle in there. And then blood is collected into a vial. Right, we go via vein. That's really important. We're not sticking arteries. The flow of blood and blood pressure in veins is much lower than arteries. The last thing you want is to stick an artery and then have blood squirting out. So this allows for a nice, more steady draw. Plus, veins are much more superficial than arteries, so that makes it a lot easier. It's already bad enough if you don't have a good phlebotomist and you're getting a needle dug into your arm. It'd be 100 times worse if we're trying to get like some very deep artery to get a blood test. You're probably also familiar with finger sticks. This is common for individuals who are diabetic. It's an easy superficial place to get blood. It heals up very quickly. And then in babies, they'll do a heel stick because babies are tiny. I mean, their fingers are so tiny and sensitive. You try to get a blood sample from them in the least painful and easiest to collect area. So that's their heel. You can see in this image there are some nerves and some arteries that you're trying to avoid. But then right here on either side is where they usually take a small little blood sample. All right. So where do blood cells form? So we call that the blood cell formation hematopoiesis or hemopoiesis. Either term is correct. In the embryo, it occurs in the yolk sac early on in development, and then in the developing fetus's liver, spleen, thymus, lymph nodes, as well as red bone marrow. Now, as adults, we continue to produce red blood cells and other white blood cells, but in the adult, it's occurring only in the red bone marrow of our flat bones like the sternum, ribs, skull, pelvis, and the end of long bones. So, important to keep in mind. All right, hopefully all of that makes sense.